Father Michael had seen his share of tragedy in his 20 years at St. Augustine's Church in a quiet town in Ohio. But nothing could prepare him for the night he was called to Mercy Hospital's morgue. A grieving mother, Mrs. Caldwell, had lost her newborn just hours after birth due to complications. She pleaded with the hospital staff to have her son baptized before he was taken away. The nurses, out of sympathy, called Father Michael. The priest arrived, carrying his small silver vial of holy water. The air in the morgue was sterile, unnervingly cold. The infant, a tiny thing wrapped in a white hospital blanket, lay still on the steel table. His skin was pale, lips slightly parted, frozen in eternal silence. With a heavy heart, Father Michael dipped his fingers into the holy water and gently traced a cross on the child's forehead. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. As soon as the words left his lips, a chill ran down his spine. The room, already cold, felt as if it had dropped 10 degrees. The fluorescent lights flickered. A metallic clang echoed from somewhere behind him. Then the baby gasped. Father Michael staggered back, his breath caught in his throat. The child's tiny chest rose and fell, his mouth quivering as if struggling for air. His eyes snapped open. The nurses screamed. One bolted out the door, calling for a doctor. Father Michael stood frozen, watching the impossible unfold. The child, declared dead hours ago, was alive. His once gray skin flushed with color, his fingers curled into delicate fists. The doctor rushed in moments later, disbelief plastered on his face as he checked the infant's vitals. A pulse, a steady heartbeat, warm skin. The mother, when she arrived, collapsed into tears, clutching her resurrected son. Father Michael, hands trembling, backed away. What had just happened? Was this a miracle? Or something else? And then, as he looked down at his vial of holy water, he noticed something odd. The once clear liquid inside had turned a murky shade of red. Father Michael stood frozen as the mother wept, clutching her miraculously revived son. The room buzzed with disbelief, nurses whispering prayers, doctors exchanging stunned glances. The impossible had happened, yet something felt deeply wrong. His gaze drifted back to the small silver vial in his trembling hand. The holy water had turned red, thick, like diluted blood. A shiver ran through him. This wasn't a miracle. This was something else. The baby didn't cry. He should have been wailing, his tiny lungs desperate for air. Instead, he just stared, his wide, dark eyes locked onto Father Michael with unsettling focus. A newborn shouldn't be able to do that. Father Michael took a cautious step forward. "Mrs. Caldwell," he said carefully, "I need to check something." The mother hesitated, but nodded. She gently loosened the blanket around her child, exposing his tiny hands. His fingernails were black. A breath hitched in Father Michael's throat. He looked closer. The baby's skin wasn't just warm. It was hot, too hot. A nurse reached out to touch his forehead and yelped, recoiling as if burned. The doctor, trying to regain composure, stammered, We need to run tests." "We should." The baby moved. Not a normal newborn movement, no weak, clumsy flailing. Instead, his tiny fingers curled with purpose. He grabbed his mother's wrist, gripping it tight. Too tight. Mrs. Caldwell winced. "Oh, sweetheart, she gasped. The skin where the baby touched her had turned gray. Veins darkened beneath the surface, spreading up her arm like ink in water. Father Michael lunged forward, grabbing her shoulders. "Let go of him, now!" But she wouldn't. She couldn't. The baby's lips parted, revealing something else unnatural. Tiny, needle-like teeth. And then he smiled. A sound filled the room. Not a baby's cry, but a whisper. Faint, ancient. A language no one should understand, yet somehow Father Michael did. "You called me back, priest. Now you will finish what you started." The air cracked, like static before a storm. The lights burst, plunging the room into darkness. And in the blackness, the baby laughed. Darkness swallowed the room. The only sound was that eerie, unnatural laugh, a sound no infant should be capable of making. It slithered through the air, a mix of childlike innocence and something far older, far hungrier. Father Michael's breath came in short gasps. His fingers fumbled for the cross around his neck as the hospital's emergency lights flickered on, bathing the room in an eerie red glow. The baby still lay in his mother's arms, but his eyes, they were no longer the deep brown of a newborn. They were black, entirely, completely black. Mrs. Caldwell's mouth quivered as she looked down at her child. Her wrist, where the baby had touched her, had turned a sickly shade of grayish blue, veins still darkening as if something was spreading inside her. "Father," she whispered, her voice breaking. "What's happening to my son?" Before he could answer, the temperature plummeted. Frost formed along the steel table. The nurses backed away, whispering hurried prayers under their breath. The doctor, his hands shaking, muttered, We need to get that baby into the NICU. Now." "No," Father Michael said. His voice was firm, but inside, he was drowning in fear. "This isn't medical. This is something else." The baby turned his head, too smoothly, too deliberately, and locked eyes with the priest. It knew him. The whisper came again, but this time, it wasn't just in Father Michael's head. It filled the room, echoing from every corner. "You brought me back. Now finish the rite, priest." A sudden, sharp crack rang out. One of the fluorescent bulbs above exploded, sending shards of glass raining down. A nurse screamed. The doctor grabbed a clipboard, as if it would somehow protect him from the impossible unfolding before him. Then the baby moved again. It sat up. "Newborns don't do that." Mrs. Caldwell gasped, her arms trembling as the infant pushed itself up on its tiny hands. The blackness in its eyes swirled, something shifting beneath the surface. And then it spoke. Not a coo, not a wail, a voice that did not belong to a child. "Your prayers brought me back, Father," it rasped. "Now, do you have the faith to send me away?" Father Michael staggered backward. His lips moved in silent prayer, but no words came. His training, his years of devotion, nothing had prepared him for this. Then, from the hallway, came a sound, a deep, metallic thudding, like something heavy dragging against the floor, coming closer. Father Michael turned toward the door, heart pounding. Something was coming, and it was coming for the child. The thudding outside the door grew louder, heavy, measured, like something dragging itself forward, inch by inch. Father Michael swallowed hard, his hands slick with sweat as he clutched his rosary. The baby, no, not a baby anymore, still sat upright in its mother's arms, watching him with those impossible black eyes. It was waiting. Mrs. Caldwell whimpered, her grip on the child loosening as fresh veins darkened her arm. She looked up at Father Michael, tears brimming in her eyes. "Help me," she whispered. "Please help my son." The priest hesitated. He wanted to believe this was still a child. But deep down, he knew whatever had returned was not the soul of her baby. The temperature dropped again. Frost spread along the metal cabinets. The breath of every person in the room became visible, curling like mist. Then bang. The door shuddered. Something was on the other side. The doctor and the nurses were pale, their bodies pressed against the farthest wall. One nurse sobbed, gripping the cross around her neck. Bang. This time, the door dented inward. And then, from the baby came a laugh, a knowing, mocking chuckle. Father Michael forced himself to move. He turned to the nurses. "Take the mother. Get her out of here. Now." Mrs. Caldwell's breathing was shallow, her skin almost translucent. The veins that had blackened her wrist were creeping toward her neck. But she wouldn't let go of the child. "I can't," she sobbed. "He's my baby." "He's not your baby anymore," Father Michael said, his voice firm, but filled with sorrow. Bang. A long, gurgling wail came from behind the door. The air crackled with something unnatural, something old. The baby slowly turned its head toward the sound. Then, in that eerie, rasping voice, it spoke again. "They've come for me." Father Michael's stomach twisted. "Who?" The baby blinked. Once, twice, before those soulless black eyes shifted. For a fleeting second, something moved behind them. A writhing darkness, a shape too large to belong inside such a small body. Then the lights died completely. For a breathless moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, a voice, not from the baby, not from the priest, but from the darkness itself. "Step aside, priest. The child is ours." The darkness in the room felt alive. It pressed against Father Michael's skin, thick and suffocating, as if the very air carried weight. The voice had come from everywhere and nowhere. "Step aside, priest. The child is ours." Father Michael's grip tightened on his rosary. His breath was ragged, his mind racing. He had faced death before. He had witnessed grief, suffering, even miracles. But this was something else. A low growl rumbled from the other side of the door. Not human, not animal, something in between. The baby, or whatever it had become, smiled. "You're afraid?" it whispered, tilting its head at Father Michael. "You should be." A second later, the door exploded inward. The impact sent metal shards flying. One of the nurses screamed as she ducked, barely avoiding a piece of the splintered frame. And then it stepped inside. A shape, tall, wrong, twisted. It was wrapped in shadows, its edges shifting, never fully solid. Its head brushed the ceiling, its limbs too long, its fingers ending in jagged points. It didn't walk. It glided forward, as if moving through water instead of air. And where its feet should have been, there were only bones. The nurses cowered in the corner, clinging to each other, sobbing. The doctor clutched his chest, whispering something under his breath, his face slick with sweat. Father Michael's heart pounded as he forced himself to stand his ground. He knew this wasn't an angel, and it wasn't a demon, at least not the kind he had read about in theological texts. It was older. "You have no authority here," Father Michael said, his voice shaking but firm. The figure didn't respond, simply turned its head, too far, too fast, toward the baby. Mrs. Caldwell gasped, her arms locked around her child. "No," she whispered. "Please, no." The shadow thing raised one bony hand, beckoning. And the baby answered. It laughed again, that unnatural ancient sound, before reaching back toward the creature. Mrs. Caldwell screamed, "No, no, he's my son. He's my." Her body jerked. Her eyes rolled back. A horrible, wet tearing sound filled the air. And then she crumpled to the floor. The baby, now free from her arms, floated. Father Michael choked back a cry as he watched the newborn rise into the air, its tiny body now surrounded by that shifting, writhing darkness. The shadow thing spoke again, its voice echoing through the walls. "He was never yours to keep." And then the lights burst back on. The baby was gone. The creature was gone. Mrs. Caldwell lay on the floor, her body eerily still. And in the sudden, deafening silence, Father Michael realized something. The room was still freezing. Whatever had taken the child, the silence was deafening. Father Michael stood frozen, his breath clouding in the cold air. The baby was gone. The thing that had come for him was gone. But the feeling in the room, the suffocating, unnatural wrongness, remained. He turned to Mrs. Caldwell. She lay motionless, her skin still touched by that sickly gray hue where her child had last held her. Her chest barely rose. A nurse hesitated before dropping to her knees, pressing 2 fingers against the woman's throat. A beat, a pause, then a sharp inhale. Mrs. Caldwell's eyes snapped open. But they weren't her eyes. They were black. Father Michael staggered backward, his stomach lurching. "No!" Mrs. Caldwell grinned. The lights flickered violently. The walls groaned as if the very foundation of the hospital had grown restless. And then she spoke, not in her voice. "You should have let us take him sooner, priest." The room plunged into chaos. The nurses screamed. The doctor ran for the door. But Mrs. Caldwell, or what was inside her now, only laughed. Her body convulsed, twisted, and then she rose. Not by pushing off the floor, not by lifting herself. She simply floated. Father Michael clutched his rosary, his lips parting in silent prayer. But the words wouldn't come. He had spent his life preaching about faith, about the power of good over evil. But here, in the cold grip of something far beyond human comprehension, he felt abandoned. The lights burst into flames. The crucifix on the wall split in 2. And Mrs. Caldwell's face, her too wide, grinning face, turned toward him. "It's not over, Father." Then the world collapsed. A roar of wind and darkness swallowed the room whole. And when it passed, Mrs. Caldwell was gone. The frost melted. The lights sputtered back to life. and all that remained was a scorched mark on the floor, shaped like an open hand. Father Michael stood there, shaking. He had witnessed something that no sermon, no scripture, no exorcism could ever explain. The baby was gone, but something else had taken its place. And deep inside he knew